By the time she was brought to Castle Caladan, Jessica was barely 17 years old. There really isn't that much to say about her backstory prior to this point. She was given the standard Bene Gesserit training, as well as some rudimentary insights into the breeding program, though she remained ignorant of her parentage and of her role in said breeding program. This suggests that it was as much the Bene Gesserit's habit of keeping its secrets close to the chest, as well as Jessica's defiance, that caused the breeding program to produce the Kwisatz Haderach to unravel and spiral beyond the Bene Gesserit's control. All she knew at the time was that she was supposed to have a daughter by Duke Leto. At the time, the Duke himself was none too thrilled with the idea. He still didn't know why the Sisterhood had intervened on his behalf when he was accused of attacking the Tleilaxu vessel, but it was clear that they intended to use him at some point, and this only seemed to confirm it. The Bene Gesserit representatives didn't come out and say that they wanted Leto to sleep with Jessica, but one didn't need the computating abilities of a Mentat to see that that was exactly what they wanted. Of course, he couldn't outright refuse the Bene Gesserit, so he allowed Jessica to stay and even gave her her own private chambers. Understandably suspicious of the Bene Gesserit and their ever-hidden motives, Leto initially refused to have anything to do with Jessica. Ultimately, what ended up bringing them together was the deterioration of Leto's relationship with his concubine Kaileia Vernius. She stubbornly continued to demand that she be made his official wife and their son Victor his official heir. Leto, just as stubborn, continued to refuse on the grounds that it was more to House Atreides' advantage that he be available to marry some daughter of the aristocracy. Her brother Romber was sympathetic and broached the matter with Leto while trying to convince him to also support the underground rebels on Ix. Leto valued his friendship with Romber, but also felt the very heavy burden of his responsibilities to House Atreides. Ultimately, he told his friend that he would either do one of the two things. Either he would help smuggle in supplies to the rebels, or he would make Kaileia his official wife, and Romber would be the one to decide which one. Romber, who greatly admired Leto and his dedication to the people of Caladan, ultimately chose to help his people rather than his sister. Unfortunately, while the rebels did have a few successes to their name, the iron grip of the Tleilaxu was too strong, and their efforts were little more than an exercise in futility. When Gurney Halleck arrived on Caladan, bringing with him the news of her father, Earl Dominic's death, Kaileia became convinced that the whole future of House Vernius rested with her and her 6-year-old son. It didn't help matters that her personal maidservant Chiara could regale her with all manner of stories of intrigues, sexual and otherwise, within Landsraad politics. Before too long, Kaileia was convinced that if Leto ever got married or found a new favorite, like, say, Jessica, he would cast her and Victor aside. Now, given Leto's obsession with honorable conduct, any sensible person could say that this is pretty ridiculous. But then again, fear is not always the most rational of emotions. And as Kaileia's paranoia continued to grow, even Romber began to lose some of his sympathy for her. It was then that Chiara pointed something out to her mistress. Illegitimate or not, the 6-year-old Victor was Leto's only child and thus the only heir to House Atreides. Now, it doesn't take a genius to see where the old maidservant was going with this, and initially Kaileia was horrified. But as Chiara herself pointed out, once you got past the main sticking point, namely contemplating the assassination of Duke Leto, the rest was mere detail. Now committed to the idea, and knowing that Leto was making a visit by skyship to one of the more far-flung communities on Caladan, Kaileia seduced Leto's own captain of the guard and stole the keys to the armory. She then had Chiara smuggle some bombs out of the armory and conceal them aboard the skyship. Leto initially wanted to take Victor with him so that the boy could get to know the people of Caladan, but Kaileia refused point blank, which the others interpreted simply as the words of an overly protective mother. Unfortunately for Kaileia's plan, Prince Romber was excessively fond of his nephew, as was the guard captain, who practically doted on the boy as if he were his own son. They both saw how sad Victor was at being forced to stay behind, and, in what they thought was a bit of harmless mischief, decided to sneak Romber and the boy aboard the skyship just before takeoff and Kaileia could object. Just to really twist the tragedy knife, it was Victor that discovered the bombs just before they detonated. Leto, of course, survived both the explosion and the crash without suffering any crippling injuries. Poor Romber was less fortunate, reduced to a half-burnt, barely living hunk of flesh and bone. Victor, of course, was killed instantly. Overcome with both grief and guilt, it was only then that the pieces began to fall into place in Kylia Vernius's mind. It was Chiara that had originally talked her into the idea of attempting Leto's assassination. In fact, her relationship with Leto had begun deteriorating shortly after Chiara's arrival on Caladan. She had always played upon Kylia's dissatisfaction with her position in life, always saying that she deserved better than to be merely the concubine of a middling nobleman. The conclusion was inescapable. Chiara was the agent of an enemy house, the Harkonnens in fact, sent to Caladan to bring about Leto's death. The attempted sabotage of the skyship had merely been the culmination of an assassination plot 6 years in the making. That is dedication and patience. Utterly distraught and bordering on the edge of madness, Kylia stabbed the old woman to death and then killed herself by jumping from a castle window. As for the luckless guard captain that had been Kylia's unwitting dupe, Leto took one look at the grief-stricken officer who had genuinely cared about Victor and decided that the only fitting punishment was that the captain be banished from Castle Caladan but left alive with his guilt. A decision for which the former captain declared him Leto the Just. If Leto wasn't already driven to the breaking point by Victor's death, the revelation of Kylia's treachery, soon revealed by Thufir Hawat's investigation, certainly did. As his relationship with his former concubine had deteriorated, Leto had become closer to Jessica. Now, she was his only lifeline, the one thing keeping him from going under, mentally speaking. Before Leto could start coming to terms with his loss, however, the Bene Tleilax arrived with an offer. Using the cells from the preserved body of Victor, they would create a Gola for Leto, effectively restoring his son to him, although this was before it was determined that Golas can in fact reclaim the memories of their previous lives. In return, they demanded the barely living body of Romber Vernius. Unlike the Bene Gesserit, the Bene Tleilax are not subtle, and they made it pretty clear that this was all to get revenge on Leto, whom they still blamed for attacking their ship. There was no telling what they would do with Romber, his genetics, or for that matter the genetics of Victor once they had made the Gola. Duncan Idaho, recently returned from his swordmaster training on Ginaz, was opposed to accepting the deal, as were Gurney and Jessica. Thufir Hawat was so opposed that he threatened to tender his resignation should Leto accept the offer. After some serious soul-searching, Leto ultimately decided to reject the Bene Tleilax's offer, for the cost, in his mind at least, was too high. It would cost him Romber's life, the good opinion of those he cared for, and, as he put it, his own soul. Thwarted yet again, the outraged Bene Tleilax departed. They would make another attempt at acquiring Atreides genetics for their own foul purposes, by essentially tomb raiding an ancient Atreides war memorial on the planet of Baikal. Outraged by the desecration, Leto sent Duncan and a task force to obliterate the memorial, rather than let the remains fall into their gray, grubby hands. Still, thwarting the Tleilaxu's schemes was of small comfort to Leto. Thanks to her Bene Gesserit training, it was Jessica who saw most clearly just how much the death of Victor had left Leto a frail and hollow shell of a man. Despite having been sleeping with him for some time now, Jessica had allowed none of those encounters to result in a pregnancy, much to the confusion of her superiors back on Wallach 9. Even in the early days, she had begun to develop feelings for the Duke Atreides, and had perhaps refrained from pregnancy out of a feeling of guilt for being instructed to use this man as a breeding stud. By now, however, those confusing and ephemeral feelings had solidified into something that could definitely be identified as love. And, to help the man she loved get over the death of his son, and in complete defiance of her instructions, Jessica allowed Leto to impregnate her, and ensured that this birth would result in a son. Besides, Jessica rationalized to herself, Once the sun came, she could always have as many daughters as the sisterhood demanded. It was not as if this one act of love was going to mess up anything really big or important, right? The best laid plans of mice and men often go astray, the old saying goes. There's certainly no reason that women, or even witches, should be exempt. The only bright spot in this horrendous tragedy was its effect on Prince Romber. At the insistence of his Bene Gesserit wife Tessia, Leto hired a Sook doctor named Wellington Yui, who specialized in prosthetics. The good doctor practically built a full cybernetic body to support what was left of Romber's fleshly body. More importantly, his near-death experience had lit a fire in the exiled Prince of Ix. Up till now, Romber Vernius had been a man that had coasted through life, simply expecting things to work out. Even his support of the rebels on Ix by smuggling them weapons and supplies had been lackluster at best. Now, however, having narrowly escaped the Grim Reaper, Romber was utterly consumed with reclaiming his world and freeing his people from the oppression of the Bene Tleilax. It was all he would think about night and day, and of course, he went to his friend Leto for help. Leto simply could not refuse this friend that had stood by him, and that had lost so much: his home, his parents, his inheritance, his sister, his nephew, and most of his body. However, he did stipulate that he would only commit his forces to a liberation of Ix if Romber could come up with a workable plan. Of course, in order to create such a plan, they needed information. And so, Gurney Halleck, with his experience as a smuggler, and Thufir Howat, with his Mentat-trained eidetic memory and computation skills, were sent to infiltrate Ix and make contact with the underground resistance. The report they brought back to Leto and Romber was a grim one. The Tleilaxu ruled with an iron fist, and the people of Ix, both the ordinary humans and the suboids, lived in misery. However, there was reason to believe that if it were known that Romber Vernius, their lawful prince, had returned to them, they would rally to his cause and overthrow the occupiers and their Sardaukar allies. And so Leto and his allies began to devise a plan. This planning was briefly interrupted when a message arrived for Jessica from the Mother Superior of the Bene Gesserit, ordering her to go to Kaitain, ostensibly to serve as a lady-in-waiting to the Emperor's Bene Gesserit wife Anarul, but in reality to ensure her safety. Several sisters, including the Empress herself, had been receiving very vague and disturbing warnings and visions, warnings that suggested that the Kwisatz Haderach breeding program was at risk. Jessica reluctantly obeyed, unwilling to leave Leto and fearful of what would happen to her once her disobedience had been uncovered. After Jessica arrived on Kaitain, the Empress Anarul and the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Moheim, now serving as the Emperor's truthsayer, decided to reveal to her that, by the way, the reason we sent you to Leto is that you're supposed to give birth to the mother of the Kwisatz Haderach. Because you see, after 10,000 years of careful breeding, we are now within 2 generations of finally achieving our goal. Oh dear. If Jessica had been afraid of the possible consequences of her disobedience before, she was absolutely terrified now. Given what was riding on this birth, there was no telling what they might do to her, or more importantly, to the yet unborn baby Paul. Meanwhile, back on Caladan, Leto and his allies had hammered out what they believed to be a near foolproof plan. At the time, the planet Baikal, the same world that had once had Nartrades' war memorial, was suffering from what looked like a bioplague killing all of their crops. Emperor Shaddam IV had just ordered a fleet of ships under the command of the leader of the Sardaukar to blockade the planet, ostensibly to prevent the plague from spreading, though Leto himself suspected that the Emperor had some ulterior motive for doing so. That said, this did provide him and his followers with an opportunity. Thufir was to take several ships full of food supplies and other relief aid to the planet, knowing that the Sardaukar would stop them. Leto, meanwhile, was to go to Kaitain and make a big speech in support of his relief action. Now, while the humanitarian aid was indeed genuine, it was also a feint. It and the speech were there to draw the attention of both the Emperor and the Landsraad. At the same time, Gurney and Romber were to sneak into Ix and rally the people to overthrow the Tleilaxu. They had to do this within a specific timetable. Ostensibly, at the same time that they launched their revolt, the Atreides military, under the command of Duncan, was to launch a full-scale invasion of the planet, hopefully crushing the Tleilaxu and their Sardaukar allies between two opposing forces. It was a solid plan, and it was almost immediately derailed when the Guild Highliner transporting Gurney and Romber suffered a significant navigator error and wound up in a patch of empty space. It turned out that the navigator's spice supply had been tainted. Unless they were able to get a new supply of spice to replace it, the navigator would die and leave them all stranded until they died of starvation. It was then that Gurney Halleck came to the rescue. Due to his history as a smuggler, Gurney knew from long experience that aboard every Guild Highliner there was almost always at least one spice smuggler ship. And it didn't take long for the Highliner's crew to discover that he was entirely correct. The smugglers were ultimately persuaded to hand over their supply of spice. After all, what good was their merchandise if they didn't live to sell it? And the Guild Navigator, despite his fatal poisoning, survived long enough to make one last fold jump back into civilized space. Specifically, he made it to Junction, the world that served as the Spacing Guild's headquarters. Despite the delay, Romber and Gurney were ultimately able to make it to Ix within the time frame, though this did mean they would have less time to rally the Ixian resistance. While Thufir made a show of arguing with the Sardaukar blockading Baykal, and Duncan was quietly leading the Atreides fleet towards Ix, Leto made his way to Kaitain, ready to make his speech and eager to see Jessica again, who was on the verge of giving birth. Now, I am sorry to once again leave you guys on a cliffhanger, but the Atreides weren't the only moving pieces in what would lead to the climax of the Prelude to Dune trilogy. Before I can do that, I have to talk about the other factions and what they were doing leading up to this point. Next week, House Harkonnen. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.